Okay, the question that we have now is what language did Jesus speak? And then we have other questions. What language was the New Testament written in? And what language was the Old Testament written in? So all of these are important questions in the history of Christianity and for Christians today and for other people too. So, well, at the time of Jesus, the common language in the Roman Empire, and Palestine was part of the Roman Empire, was actually Greek. Okay, there was Latin in the background. The language of the state and of the legal system was Latin, but the language spoken by the people in the marketplace, the language of education, was Greek, because when the Romans conquered the Greek-speaking world of the east side of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, which had been Hellenized by Alexander the Great, they were actually Hellenized themselves, because they brought the Greek-educated men into their homes to teach their children, and so the Greek education, the Greek language, the Greek philosophy, the sciences, and all of those things that were common for the Greek-speaking world at the time were brought into the homes of the Romans, and eventually the Romans spoke Greek everywhere. So, the question is, what language did Jesus speak? Did he speak Greek? We are not sure. But the common language, perhaps, of the people in Palestine was Aramaic. Why wasn't it Hebrew? That's a good question. It's because Hebrew had discontinued to be used for a long time by now, by the time of Jesus. In fact, Hebrew stopped being used officially, and the people, the Jewish people that were scattered around the area, even in Palestine, didn't really use Hebrew. They spoke Greek mostly, or Aramaic, or the local languages where they were, to the point that about 150 years before Christ, in Alexandria, Egypt, which was a Greek-speaking city, and a third of the population was Jewish, we have the Jewish community wanting the Bible, the Old Testament, in their language that they speak. So they get together 70 scholars who translated all the Hebrew books of the Old Testament into Greek. And Greek was their language that they used in worship, and there was the language that they read the scriptures in. So this is the Jewish people now, even 150 years before Christ is born. So at the time of Christ, the common text of the Old Testament used by Jews around the Roman Empire was actually that Greek text which the 70 scholars of Alexandria, Egypt produced, which we call it today the Septuagint, the text of the 70 scholars, the Jewish scholars. So in the Orthodox Church, we still use that as the official text of the Old Testament. And in the Greek Orthodox Church, we still read the Psalms in that, and we recite a lot of the Psalms and also the readings of the Old Testament in that particular version of the Septuagint. So, did Jesus speak Greek? We're not sure. He probably used Aramaic, but he probably also spoke Greek. Of course, he's God and he can speak all the languages, but that's another story, okay? Now, but the apostles spread the gospel in Greek. So, what language was the New Testament written in? Is another question, and the answer is Greek. All of the New Testament was written in Greek, and it was all of the books of the New Testament were written in the first century, before the year 100. And scholars today have figured it out, and they kind of they can point out exactly when everything was put together, and when everything was published in that way. And we know a lot of things about the dating of the texts and all of those things. And all the New Testament texts are from the first century, and they were all in Greek. There is a theory that there was one. The Gospel of Matthew was probably also written in Aramaic, but we don't have a text, and therefore we cannot claim that there is an Aramaic text. So, another point that I make in this particular, when I'm asked this question about the language of the Bible, is that we know, for example, that Greek was used everywhere, because when St. Paul wrote to the Romans, he wrote to them in Greek. Not in Latin, but in Greek, because Greek was as I said before, the official language that they used everywhere, especially among the educated people who were able to read and write at that time.